Today is an exciting day on my veg patch because it's time to harvest one of my favourite crops. Now, as you can see, there's been a heck of a lot of growth in here. It's been a challenging year for veg because they like to keep growing continuously, but these really hot spells have meant I've had to do quite a lot of irrigation just to keep the moisture in the soil and stop a lot of things running to seed. But the onions are keeping on growing. I've sown a lot of flowers. We've got borage here, we've got marigolds to bring in the pollinators. But the buried treasure I want to unearth, hoping it's there, just round here. Now, you may remember that back in April I planted what we call seed potatoes, Charlottes, and I planted them in rows on the veg patch where they've done really quite well. But I also planted 5 seed potatoes in each of these 3 sacks here, showing what you could do with a potato bag if you've got no space at all for a veg patch. I just added more compost as the shoots grew out of the top, filling it up that little bit higher. There's a good amount of foliage on each of these bags, so the indication would be that there might be a decent crop underneath. Generally speaking, it's time to harvest in the row when the plants are flowering. There are no flowers on here at all, but I'm still convinced that down in there, I'm hoping, there will be a decent crop of spuds, and they'll all be lovely and edible and succulent as opposed to nasty and green. Just a quick reminder to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. This is a growing community for people who know nothing about gardening but want to learn, and for those who are more experienced, so come and join us. What I have done is made sure I didn't let them dry out, even so they're still quite heavy. I want to try and use these bags again, so I'm not going to slit them. The bees are very interested. I'm just going to tip it out if it'll come. Bash it about a bit. And then, wish me luck. Out it comes. Have we got? And oh, look. There we are. I don't reckon that's going to be a bad crop. I put in 5 seed potatoes, which would have cost me, it was £2.99 for 10, so I'll call it £1.50. Now let's see what I get. It's a childlike feeling. It's what gardening's all about. It's that moment of truth, but also of satisfaction, of knowing that this is a crop that wouldn't exist unless you'd grown it, that will taste far better than anything you buy in the shops. Now, I know potatoes are quite cheap, but you know, when you take a homegrown one like this and pop it in the pan within minutes of it being harvested, and there's that great sense of satisfaction, of achievement. You know, new potatoes are such beautiful things, aren't they? Isn't it amazing how much pleasure you can just get out of knowing that they didn't exist back in April, and now in July, here they are. A good square meal. Such a lot, look. On and on and on. I'm not complaining. I grew my first potatoes when I was probably about 10. I was probably just into double figures. And it was magical. The ludicrous thing is, all these years on, I still get exactly the same thrill as I did when I was 10 from uprooting my first crop of potatoes. I suppose some people might think it's rather pathetic, rather childish, but for me it's the stuff of life. It's not childish at all. It's the most basic of pleasures, of human endeavours, of growing something to feed yourself with, and it wipes away all the sort of sophistication of modern life. And you think, if life is about feeding yourself, which it is really, both spiritually and physically, then harvesting potatoes is a wonderful sort of token gesture about the purity of it all. 5 little spuds planted in a sack of compost, and I've got out of it, gosh, half a dozen meals for me and Mrs. T. So, success with the spuds, but let me show you some other things you can be doing through the summer to keep your veg garden cropping right the way through until autumn. If you have trained fruit trees in your garden, like these step-over apples, you need to summer prune them to concentrate their efforts into making flower buds and fruits next year, rather than these long vegetative growths that are here. We don't need these, so snip them back to round about 2 inches just above a leaf. That'll concentrate the tree's energy on making next year's blossom. If you have rows of crops, run a hoe between them, lightly skimming across the surface, being careful not to damage, in this case, my onions, but just skimming off any annual weed growth. That'll make sure it dries in the sun and allows the crop itself to mature unimpeded. Veg crops in particular are susceptible to drying out, and if they do dry out, they'll stop growing and start running to seed or just fizzling out. So do try and keep that soil around them moist at all times, and as soon as it shows signs of drying out in summer heat, turn on a sprinkler and make sure they're well watered. And then, of course, there are your tomato plants. You may remember that I started with the tomatoes outside. I didn't know what the summer was going to be like when I planted them, and I wanted to make sure they cropped. So I moved them into here when the seedlings had gone. I thought I might as well get the tomatoes into the greenhouse. 2 plants in the growing bag. They've gone ape. What I need to do now, and we do it with all tomatoes, is to thin out the lower foliage to let a bit more air and a degree of light get around the crop that's developing. So some of these leaves which are in here, I'm simply going to snip off. You don't need to do as the old gardeners used to do, denude it right the way up. I'm not doing that. But if I cut some of this lower foliage off with a pair of sharp secateurs, you'll be able to see the first crop. Yeah, for all the good times, aren't you? Now, I'm just going to take this off. And if you look at the stalk of the tomato, you'll see the swollen bit there. Now what I'm going to do is put my finger against that, press into it and pull it away, twisting it so it breaks at that point. There we are, and that's how it's meant to be picked. It's not a perfect tomato, but it's sun warmed, it smells delicious, and it'll do me for my tea. Remember back in April, I sowed this little raised bed with salad crops, mesclun, mizuna, rocket, lettuce. It all came up beautifully. We harvested it for weeks, but there comes a point where it goes over the hill. It gets too big, it's more acrid tasting, and you think, cut your losses, Alan, pull it all out, pop it on the compost heap and re-sow. I topped up with a bit of fresh compost on the top, and then I sowed just 2 weeks ago, looking at the label here, lettuce, radishes, mustard and coriander, and I've left a gap in the middle to sow some more mizuna. So, same way as before. It's lovely moist compost. I'm just pressing this cane into the surface to make a little tiny furrow. It doesn't need to be more than 1/4 to 1/2 inch deep, about 1 centimetre, and I'm going to sprinkle them quite thinly along the row. And if they come up too thickly, though, with these little thin leaved crops, it doesn't really matter. You just leave them all in and don't bother to thin them. And then with your fingers just lightly flick back the soil. You're not burying them terribly deeply. Flick back the soil over that little furrow until the seeds just disappear I shall water that in now and then look forward to a succession of crops. And that's the joy of a veg patch. There's always something happening, there's always something coming to maturity. And as with most things in gardening, anticipation is half the fun. I can't believe we've just had our 2 millionth view on the channel. So thank you so much. And if you want to join our growing community, just click below and subscribe.